Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this session on leveraging employee confidence during economic downturns. I'm your presenter, Jerry Seibert, and very much appreciate your taking a little time out of your day today to join us. I hope you've had also the chance to attend some of the earlier sessions for our second virtual conference. We have a full slate for later this afternoon and tomorrow as well, and I hope you can join us for those. We've been faced as members of organizations with making some very important choices over the past months and will continue to do so over the coming months, choices that will have some significant and lasting consequences for our organizations. These choices are going to affect the people within our organizations. It's going to affect how aligned employees feel within the company, the capabilities that they have to meet customer expectations, with whether those are external or internal customers. It's going to affect their level of engagement and their degree of confidence in the future. I'd like to talk about, to start off, some of those specific choices and their consequences. And this comes out of research that I did in past economic downturns, but in a study that included over 2,000 companies. So I'm fairly confident that will apply again in the current environment. We looked at how various types of choices impacted how aligned employees were, whether they had those capabilities to meet customer expectations and their level of engagement. And we looked at that about 1 year after the actions were taken, after the choices were made. And one of the things we learned was that some of the common responses to a downturn don't all have the expected effects on employees. Tactics such as layoffs, budget cuts, hiring freezes, they did uniformly have a negative impact on alignment, capabilities, and engagement levels, and I'm going to call that ACE for short. These actions, which include some of the most severe responses you can take in response to a downturn, can really leave employees feeling like maybe they need to carry a heavier load but aren't getting any additional recognition. With fewer resources in the organization, capabilities would decline. That makes sense. And there can be some perceived inequity of these tactics that can really weaken engagement. And cutting back also can lead to sort of a value disconnect between employees and their company, thereby undermining alignment. Employees can find it difficult to be in sync with the strategic direction of a company when they see those around them losing their jobs. All in all, when these are the choices, it's a bad situation for both the organization and its employees. In an interesting contrast, the effects of compensation-oriented choices were very different. Pay cuts, pay freezes, benefit reductions do have a negative impact on employee engagement, as you'd expect. But compensation cuts in our research had no significant impact on alignment or capabilities. It's possible these actions, while certainly not welcomed, are more likely to be viewed as rational and acceptable, sharing the pain through lower profits for the company and lower rewards for staff. Thus, alignment, can be maintained, and with resources preserved in the organization, capabilities may remain largely intact. Now, furloughs also cut pay, but they do so by reducing total work hours. And unlike layoffs, workers remain employees. Now, as with the other compensation techniques, use of furloughs had no impact on alignment and capabilities, but they also had no impact on engagement. So as a technique, when companies deployed this as a means of dealing with the downturn, across the board, it didn't bring any of these down as of 1 year later. And perhaps that's because, unlike the other actions, a furlough, maybe it's viewed as somewhat more equitable. You don't get paid, but you're also not required to work during the furlough. Now, there are more subtle options than those first ones, right, which are a little bit of slash and burn from one perspective. However, options such as reducing service levels internally or to customers perhaps unexpectedly, actually had a larger negative impact on alignment capabilities and engagement. Reducing services to customers really did have a strong negative effect. I think employees, might see a serious disconnect between the frequently repeated strategies and mission statements that emphasize customer service, and then actions that may damage customer relationships, maybe even cause some harm to customers themselves. So it's no shock that aspects of engagement, such as advocacy, meaning a willingness to recommend the company, and discretionary effort, might also decline in such a context. The effect was even stronger when the choices companies made reduced the ability of departments to meet each other's needs to service, quote, internal customers. Now, logically, changes that would imperil a department's ability to service other internal groups would lead to lower perceptions of capabilities. After all, points of failure within the organization can reasonably be expected to ultimately lead to failures with customers. Employees may also have felt less certain that they were on the same page, same strategic page as senior leadership, thus lessening alignment. The strong impact on engagement is a little more curious, and it may be a reaction to being placed in a situation where you're actually prevented from doing the best work possible, resulting in a certain degree of cognitive dissonance. Or perhaps it flows from frustration with a lack of support from other parts of the organization. Each of these choices that I've talked about so far can be considered reductive, if not actually destructive, in their fundamental nature. Leaders may choose to think of them as sort of pruning now for future growth, but that doesn't change the fact that pruning has serious repercussions for employees and the customers they serve. Now, there was one choice we found that had a very different impact. A decision to focus on identifying process changes as a means to reduce cost. This approach maintained consistency with pre-downturn goals. So looking within the organization to collaboratively make improvements and reduce costs actually increases alignment. And of course, effective process improvement drives increased capabilities. For employees, it represents the company opting for surgery over amputation. Not surprisingly, this choice actually led to higher levels of engagement. Employees are highly attuned to organizational behavior that values people and recognizes their ability to help a company prevail in challenging times. And success in these efforts is inherently rewarding, leading to a sense of accomplishment and feelings that one's contributions are important and meaningful. That is a strategy that can actually build confidence. I think there is a lesson here for every organization that is today facing a difficult future. You really need to live those corporate values, which almost always define employees as the most valuable assets. So we need to treat them as if they really are just that, and tap into the wealth of knowledge they have to drive costs out of your systems. As an approach, it may not be as fast as issuing pink slips, but in the long run, it will absolutely serve the organization better. So that is how we've seen choices play out in the past. But what does our current state tell us? Is there anything we can look at that is a leading indicator of what to expect moving forward? Well, in fact, there is. There's a construct we've developed called employee confidence. And this is something we've tracked over multiple economic downturns and business crises. It includes both an internal and external aspect for both individual and organizational perspectives. A high level of employee confidence is achieved when employees perceive their organization as being effectively managed with smoothly functioning processes, when they see their organization as being competitive with strong products, and when they believe that they have a promising future with their organization, that there's some job security for them, and that the skills they have are even perhaps attractive to other employers, and there's some opportunity to develop those skills within the organization. And it's important because, employee attitudes will affect and actually will reflect not just, the behavior, their own and the behavior of others, but organizational performance, industry trends, even country level macroeconomic indicators, and of course, the major events like the pandemic. Our research has shown that at the macro level, employee confidence aligns very closely with GDP across countries. And within the US, it's been shown as very predictive of unemployment 3 months and 6 months later. So a drop in employee confidence in one quarter is highly predictive of increased unemployment in the subsequent 2 quarters. Confidence is also a leading indicator of company performance, which makes sense because who knows the company better than the employees? When we look at metrics such as earnings per share, we see huge swings in returns comparing the top quartile companies on employee confidence compared to the bottom quartile. And it translates to the personal level as well. Intention to stay is actually the best predictor of actual retention. So people say, yeah, I think I'm going to be here. That's the single strongest predictor of whether or not they'll stay. And employees with high confidence are twice as likely to have the intention to stay with their company for a long period of time, for 5 or more years, or even 10 or more years looking forward. So where are we now? Well, with that understanding of the long-term impact of choices companies were making, and when the severity of the pandemic began to come clear, we knew that one of the greatest challenges organizations would face is keeping in touch with employees, especially as their work shifted in so many cases from on-site to remote. Knowing what employees needed in terms of resources and support, understanding if critical messages from leadership were getting through. These are things that can be very difficult to keep track of in a crisis. We also knew from work we did during past crises that the impact on mental health of the employees, the stress of the situation would be significant, that there would be all sorts of impacts for individuals and for organizations. Some organizations have the means and resources to conduct pulse surveys and maintain that connection with their employees, but many other organizations do not, particularly under the strains of a crisis with such significant economic impact as this one. And that's particularly true for smaller and nonprofit organizations, which have been hit really hard. So we felt at OrgVitality that making a quality survey designed by industrial organizational psychologists and making it freely available to any organization that needed it was something that we could do to help during the pandemic. It was an ideal way to bring our particular expertise to bear. The Employee Wellbeing and Business Resilience Survey that we developed covers several key topics. It covers the company response. Did employees see that response as timely? Was it effective? Did the company seem appropriately focused on their health and safety? It covered communication effectiveness. Were communications from senior leaders transparent and open? Were the new rules for sick time or time off clear? Were staff comfortable speaking to their manager about pandemic-related issues? It addressed their ability to work and collaborate. Did they see that the functional processes had been appropriately changed and were actually working for remote work for those who had to shift? Did new processes for those who still worked on site seem to be protecting their safety? Did they have the necessary tools and resources available? And of course, it looked at their confidence in the future. Over the course of about 7 weeks during the first COVID peak in the spring, over 60,000 employees took the survey from a range of organizations that ranged from global pharmaceuticals to local animal shelters, providing a very rich and diverse data set for further analysis. So what did we see? Overall, the results from that survey were extremely favorable. 93% thought that their senior leaders had really responded quickly to the crisis, and 92% of employees felt that the organization's response had been pretty effective. Actually, this echoes our research from previous crises, including after 9/11 and after the 2008 financial crisis. We've seen that, in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, employees give their organizations some leeway. They're looking for honest, effective, and open leadership. And there's a bit of let's rally around the flag that goes on. But even taking that factor into account, these are exceptionally encouraging results. Senior leaders play a very large role in creating confidence. What they say, how they say it, how transparent and authentic they appear. Across our study, leaders got pretty good marks, but it was not always consistent. Transparency and openness comes more naturally to some leaders. Others just may not realize how much weight employees put on communication from the top. So while most employees still felt that senior leader communication was transparent and open when we aggregated the data, in fact, the range of scores was exceptionally wide on that question. There were companies that had 100% agreement on that, and companies that went down into the 50s. So this would certainly be an important area for you to monitor in your own organization. How are people viewing those communications? Maybe there's a lot of communication going on, but is it being believed? Is it seen as transparent and open? When it came to having the ability to work and collaborate, which is one of the organizational requirements for employee confidence, we asked several questions. And overall, these averages are also very solid. People did tend to feel that, their teams were adapting, that collaboration was working. But you can see there was some range in scores. Particularly when it came to having the necessary tools and resources. This was another area of some real inconsistency across companies with a very wide range of scores, more than 30 points separating the top from the bottom. Most companies were doing reasonably well, ensuring staff had what they needed, as evidenced by that overall average of 86% favorable. But some were truly struggling, with less than 2/3 of employees reporting that they had what they needed to be effective. But one of the areas with the most variability across companies was how well employees felt they were able to balance work and non-work in the new environment. And scores really were all over the map on this. And it was not just variation between companies. There were major differences within companies as well. Staff in corporate support roles like human resources, law, supply chain, IT, finance were much more favorable than those in operations or production roles, or than those in customer-facing roles. At least part of that is probably due to the fact that they were more likely to have had some work-from-home experience in the past, more so than if you're in a production or a customer-facing environment, at least. So maybe more of them had a home office and they had some practice at getting work done remotely. We don't know for sure, but that seems like a reasonable hypothesis. Customer-facing staff were having the most difficult time, however. And that was not from suddenly working from home. In fact, we split them by where they were currently working. And those working remotely were almost as favorable in their responses as the corporate support people. It was really the group that was still functioning on site that were having the most stress over balancing work and personal demands. So these are the employees who are still functioning as care providers, for example, or who had to be present in retail settings or banking, supermarkets, other settings where customer interaction was still occurring. They were doing that at the same time that perhaps their children were at home attempting to do remote learning. So they had everything to deal with that employees who were now suddenly working from home were, plus that challenge of, dealing with perhaps schools that were no longer open. Despite all of this, at the spring peak, there was still a high degree of confidence on the part of employees. A few organizations had less than 3/4 be confident in their company's future, down around the 68 to 70% range. Otherwise, this level of confidence was quite consistent across companies. Even the customer-facing employees have been feeling confident despite their struggles. So overall, we found some exceptionally positive results. Employees generally thought their organizations were responding effectively, although that didn't mean they had no issues. But companies should be reassured that employees have seen and appreciate what they have done in response to the pandemic. In fact, I would say that they should feel pretty good about the agility they've shown in the face of this crisis. But they can't take this situation for granted. I said at the beginning that there was this tendency to sort of rally around the leadership, and that's a pattern we've seen before. And in the past, we've seen that high scores like this fade over time, post-crisis. So, you can think of these high scores as being on loan. If you don't work to maintain them, they will not last. So it is absolutely essential that organizations stay focused. The intensity of your response has to be kept up. And it's becoming clear that even after this pandemic is behind us, there will be new ways of working. All the implications and repercussions of that won't be clear for quite some time. So how can we leverage what we have? Well, if we take the survey as reasonably representative, then most companies have been given a great opportunity. Instead of having to create employee confidence, they have it as a starting point. But as I said, it may not be fully, quote, earned. Remember that some portion of that, may be due to that historic pattern where employees rally in a crisis, just the way that communities do in the face of natural disasters so often. And doubtless, there is a lot of change and plenty of crisis still left to face. Maybe we'll have a vaccine this year, maybe not. Will the economy have a V-shape with a fast recovery? It's hard to say. But it is the case that some companies which have made it this far are running out of space to maneuver. The airlines are a good example, with many of them now planning massive layoffs in the coming months. We don't know if other companies are also coming to the end of their lifelines, and if they are, will that trigger another tailspin of the economy? Still a big question mark. We can only control what we do in our own organizations. And for that, we recommend an approach we call Message Performance Future. It's a model that works for organizations undergoing transitions, and I'd say that includes surviving a pandemic. So this would also be an excellent way to really leverage that degree of employee confidence that we have at the moment. The first part of the model is messaging. Communicate, communicate, communicate. You cannot over-communicate in this situation. You need to remind people what has been done, explain what actions are now being taken, and clearly explain the future plans, the strategy for changing and adapting. And given how much the nature of the work has changed for so many people, you have to let them know what changes are temporary and which are permanent. And that is a story that you have to stay consistent with. I think about all the schools, both local schools and universities, that announced one plan, changed it the next week, and then changed it again a few days later. They're having in-person classes, virtuals, hybrid, alternating cohorts. This is incredibly frustrating for parents and students. So don't do that to your employees. Right? Think it through and be as consistent as possible in your communications about what's going to happen. In terms of performance, investing in those employees who remain will both enhance capabilities within the company and continue to build and maintain confidence. In effect, by doing that, you are reinforcing your certainty in the future and underscoring that with employees. And that, in and of itself, will help to envision the future. Investing in employees is a convincing argument that you see a place for them in the future. But you should be explicit. That means senior leader communication is only part of the process. Managers should have discussions, especially with key employees that you really want to maximize the retention of. They should have discussions about what is likely to come and how that employee will play a role in that success. Beyond that, there is another way to get them involved in inventing the future for the organization. Remember at the beginning of the session, I showed how the various choices companies typically make in response to a downturn have consequences, and most of those consequences were negative or neutral at best, but one had a positive impact, even a year later, resulting in improved organizational alignment, building capabilities, and increasing employee engagement. That choice was taking a collaborative, problem-solving approach to change, making improvements in systems and processes to drive out costs and increase efficiencies. Now that is also involving them in inventing the future at the very ground level. And so we've actually come full circle back to choices and consequences. This economic downturn represents an opportunity for any organization to make changes in its normal operating procedures. A crisis of this magnitude creates a somewhat rare situation where the rules are in flux and are more easily modified before being refrozen into potentially more beneficial patterns. We can challenge the beliefs, the values, attitudes, and behaviors that currently define our organizations. Things like attitudes towards remote work are just one example of the old ways that have been unfrozen, changes applied, whether we were ready for them or not, and now new attitudes and behaviors and processes are being refrozen in place. The challenge we're facing today is to take a broader view than just surviving the crisis, if we can. We have an opportunity for organizations to re-examine themselves, and it's the urgency of the crisis that has applied the energy to unfreeze the equilibrium. It is up to us how we apply that energy and make choices that just get us through the short term, or choices that build for the long term and create a new equilibrium that is stronger than the old one. So we're coming up on the end of our time here. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We only have a minute, so we can respond to those offline after the fact. We do have more sessions coming up this afternoon. I hope you're able to join us for some of those. And I did want to mention that that survey, the Employee Wellbeing and Business Resilience, is actually one of an entire suite of free surveys that your organization can access at OrgVitality.com. So if you have a chance, please take a look at those and see if one of them will be helpful for you. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.